It is great to be back in Stockholm. This talk is called Fear, and I added a fear to my list this weekend. Actually, I'm from Texas, and in Texas we have spicy food. We actually have painfully spicy food. And I went to an Indian place last night, and I have my family with me, and I about killed my daughter. The waiter said, "Oh no, you don't want to try that. It's spicy." And when we hear spicy in a place like Stockholm, we hear in Texas what we would call whitey hot, which is not very spicy. So I said, "Oh, it's okay. She can do spicy." And so the waiter smiled, and my wife took that as, "Oh, it's going to be okay." I took that as, "Oh no, I've made him mad." And he made me a spicy dish that was beyond whitey hot. And it hurt, and I have one more fear to add to my list. Thank you for the introduction. I did write the book 7 Languages in 7 Weeks. I was the editor for the book 7 Databases in 7 Weeks and 7 Concurrency Models in 7 Weeks. Are you here, Paul? Paul Butcher in the back. A great book that's coming out in the next couple of weeks that talks about concurrency models, and as you would imagine, Erlang is right in the middle of it. So this is an interesting talk because I had planned to do more technical talks for this conference, and Francesco came to me and he said, "What was the talk you wrote last? Snake bitten. I liked that talk. Well, I want more talks like that one." And I said, "Darn," because these talks take a lot more research and a lot more polish, but I hope you agree that the result is worth it. So up until about a couple of months ago, I didn't know quite where I was going for this talk, and I took a kayaking trip where I kayaked along the whole length of a lake in Texas. And you might think, hey, that's Texas, they don't have much water. This is Lake Travis, and it's normally 64 miles long. What's that, 40-something kilometers? And 42 miles were accessible. The rest were in drought. The rest was pretty dry. Oh, right, going in the wrong direction. But anyway, I had a lot of time to think about fear. One of the things that we were going to do in this kayaking expedition is to pull over to the side of the bank and camp. And a lot of the banks are like this one. They're a little bit rocky. And in Texas, we have rattlesnakes and scorpions, and they like the water, and they like the night, exactly when we'd be pulling over to camp. And I was a little worried. But I thought a lot about fear, and I wanted to think about the concept of fear away from the concept of languages. And I thought, there are effects of fear that even change the way that our world is marked. And you can even see fear from space, in the Great Wall of China. And then I thought a little bit more about fear, and I thought, language creation is like exploration. And exploration is really in conflict with fear. Does that make sense? Because you have to overcome your fear to explore and to do new things. And that's very much like the creation of language. So I thought, maybe this wasn't such a great idea for a talk, fear and language creation. But then I started looking around about fear and the creative process. And there's all kinds of information out there. I'm a writer, and fear manifests itself in the form of writer's block. And the same thing happens with artists, all different kinds of artists. My mother was an artist, and sometimes I thought that I was the canvas that she was working on. She was actually a better artist with the canvas and paint than she was in real life. But so I thought, maybe the idea of thinking about fear and language creation is a bad idea. But the concept of talking about fear and language adoption is very much front and center. In fact, a number of years ago, actually in 1991, that's what, 23 years ago, there was a book called Crossing the Chasm. I'm sure a number of you have seen it. How many of you have heard of this book? Okay, good, good. What's that? Must read, yes, yes. It's a fantastic book for technology people, especially technology marketing people in Sweden. You have secrets that you don't like to talk about that the world needs. But the concepts behind Crossing the Chasm are that more people adopt a technology in the center of, so if this axis is time, more people have adopted the technology in the middle than at the beginning. And at the beginning, there are these innovators, and then early adopters, and then there's an early majority and a late majority, and then the laggards at the end. And language adoption tends to work in the same way. In fact, it works the same way many, many times over the course of our careers. In fact, it happens for every new language that we adopt. You'll see lots of little cycles. And this has nice, even cycles, but we know that that's not true. Sometimes languages come in a hurry, and sometimes they take a little longer. Sometimes these waves come in one after another. Sometimes they overlap. All of us use many languages at the same time during the course of our jobs. If you're an internet programmer, you're using HTML and probably some SQL and probably some JavaScript and hopefully some Erlang and maybe soon some Elixir. And then there's a longer, harder cycle to overcome in the emergence of programming paradigms. How many of you were at EUC last year for the keynote on snakebitten? Okay, a good number of you. So one of my premises was that these, while the waves, the language adoption waves for individual programming languages are uneven with unequal sizes and overlapping. These are very, very regular if you look at the major programming paradigm that's prevalent at the time. These happen every 20 years or so, and you can almost set your watch by it. It's almost like the Swedish trains. They just come with a pretty amazing, oh, hey, I've been to Italy and I know. Okay. But there's a gap in this curve that's called the chasm. And the gap is what we've all experienced when you've got this great new technology. When I was a kid, I had the 8-track tape. Did anybody else have an 8-track tape? Oh, I'm kind of dating myself as if anyone else would. But so there are technologies that make it and a lot of technologies that don't. There are more technologies that don't make it than do. And there's been a lot of discussion in the marketing world about what it takes to get a technology across the chasm. So basically, when you look at this particular concept, you might say, who cares? In fact, in the Erlang community, this is such a wonderful, beautiful thing. You might think, we don't want any more users. We don't want our language to cross the chasm at all. So, but what we're really looking for is the community that happens on the other side of the chasm. And you might have a question, how much community is enough? Don't we have enough community? Can we stop reaching out? Can we stop growing and keep things where they are? Well, what tends to happen if you stagnate is that there is a brain drain and that most of the interesting people move on and the results aren't good for a language or community. I can say it another way, that with crossing the chasm comes things that are interesting to us. Sure, there are more people, but there are also more jobs and tools. There are frameworks to do more of the work available for free, more of us to share the load of working on them. There are more conferences like this one where you can go out and enjoy and learn, and more training that's available. And if that's not enough for you, how many of you enjoy your time at the EUC? I think that this is an almost magical community, and I don't think that many of you appreciate how special this is. And more of this can come with crossing the chasm. Right? So this is about where, in this talk, Jeffrey Moore ends, and the crossing the chasm theory ends, and the well-researched, well-thought-out, basically, the good part of the talk has ended. And now we're going to move into the Bruce Tate part of the talk, where I will talk about my theories of language evolution, mostly from observing what's happened over the last 25 years or so. So, it's my theory that there are two major fears that are involved in crossing the chasm. There's a paralyzing or a stabilizing fear that tends to make the chasm bigger. And there's a motivating fear that tends to push things across. So these types of fears are in conflict. So the paralyzing fear increases the size of the chasm. And we all know what some of these fears look like. What are some of the objections that you people in this room have heard when you've told your boss, I want to adopt Erlang? What has made your boss say no? Yes. Who else is using this, right? So that's really what this is all about. And why does a boss care who else is using the language? They've got to get tools and support and things like this. What else? What are some of the other objections that you've had to crossing the chasm? Zach?
Where can we hire new engineers?
Yes, where do I get staff to help me with it? What else? Right? These are all the types of things that happen every time we try to cross the chasm with a new language. And remember, this gets bigger, and much larger. And by not quite an order of magnitude, but almost, when you cross the chasm with a language and a programming paradigm. And that's what we're up against today. So these fears are pretty massive in the eyes of a manager. These are actually the things that good managers seek, the types of risks that good managers seek to mitigate. So that the chasm stops looking like something like this and starts looking like this. And if you are interested in new programming languages, then this is also where the programming language graveyard happens. Right? And you can see it in your head, right? You can see these new languages being written, and gosh, I'm trying to build this new community for Buzz, for this language called Buzz, and I'm trying to build up the excitement, and I've got to write documentation, and it's all on me, right? So a programming language isn't really built for the computer; it's built for the people. So I'm really trying to gather enough critical mass to draw actually the second person into Buzz. And then maybe it never gets beyond that. Maybe I grow it up to 10, or maybe I grow it up to something that's used in just my university. But it's a very difficult thing to move from this side of the chasm to the other side of the chasm. And it gets harder and harder and harder as you approach the end of one paradigm and the beginning of the next. And so, what's happened until the last couple of years is that we've had very few, very large technologies or languages that have crossed the chasm. Right? And that one, if you throw in C#, looks pretty big right now. In fact, it looks really big right now. And I'm not sure that anybody could ever overcome that type of momentum. And again, it's not just that chasm that we need to cross right now. We have a bigger cycle for paradigm adoption with bigger chasms. Right? So that's the scary fear. That's the fear that stabilizes things and won't let things move on. But then there's the motivating fear, And that should be the exciting fear in this room right now, because right now, Erlang is almost uniquely positioned to solve the challenges that are in front of us. Those are the things that are going to push the language, or basically the next language or languages that are broadly popular across the chasm. And when this happens, it happens very, very quickly. Right? So the last time that we did this was with Java and C++. And we talked a little bit about this in the snake bitten talk. But this was an important chasm crossing because this ++ looks like object-oriented features. C++ was not really an object-oriented language as we all used it. It was more of a bridging language. Most people that use C++ wrote procedural code with it. So it was a C++ minus minus, right? So, but what actually happens here is at some point, the paralyzing fears, there's too much to learn, we're too proprietary, we're on old hardware, and all of this is really, in this case, we were looking at a Microsoft monopoly, and we had to overcome this at the same time as we had to overcome everything else to cross the chasm. And at some point, the motivating fear grows beyond the size of the paralyzing fear, and then we tip. So in this case, we made the paralyzing fears smaller, right? There's too much to learn, so we adopt a C++ syntax. It's proprietary, so we instead of deploying a new language, we deploy a browser, and then everything can run in the browser. And instead of worrying about portability, we build a portability layer on multiple systems and then run things on top of that, right? But the big thing that tipped Java was the business problem, and this is always true. So when you look for language adoption, don't look at cool language features. Look at the business drivers, right? So the people that are most successful with relating the business problems of the day are going to be the people that control the language and have their language tip. Right? So for Java, the problem was a deployment problem. Right? Does anybody remember this? I was actually one of the guys with roller skates and diskettes, and mine wasn't Windows, mine was OS2, and there weren't 10 diskettes, there were 16, and I know because I was the one that had to come in on weekends and actually do some of the installation. This was as late as, I did this maybe in '94. And, we started to automate that a little bit shortly after that, maybe a little bit before if you were one of the lucky few. But it really wasn't this, was it? Really, it was every system in your data center, and every data center in your company, and this kind of grew. And it wasn't just this set of challenges. It was more like this. Right? Where you had more than one vendor to worry about. So now it just wasn't that you were running this version of OS2 with this database manager, with this LAN manager, with this communication manager, and they all had to work together. And then you lob another vendor in there with a Lotus set of products, right? Remember Lotus 1, 2, 3 and Lotus Notes and all that stuff? And then you chunked in fragile programming techniques because we, the glass house, the people that control the architecture, we were pushing our programming languages, but because we had to deal with all these challenges, we had a backlog. So there was all this backlog, and the line of business people said, okay, that's great, but I can't wait. So they were starting to build their own applications and spreadsheets and macros and Visual Basic. And the IT houses got crushed beneath the weight. And that's why Java tipped, right? It was not a cool reason. It was not a cool feature of the Java programming language. It was because Java saw the business problem of the day. Part of it was portability, but most of it was being able to deploy on the internet, right? Because when you can deploy a browser one time on whatever operating system that you choose, the whole game changes. And that's the type of that's the type of business problem that we need to be looking for today. That's exactly the type of business problem that's facing us today with multicore. So Java crosses the chasm. And now we have a big old elephant parked right on the edge of the chasm. And what do? And what is changing fast enough to move that big old elephant off the end of the chasm? This isn't just Java. This is the Java family of languages. We could throw in the C#. We could also throw in the object-oriented paradigm, right? And all of the little languages that are popping up that are trying to fix things in Java that stink, right? The Rubies, we're trading in. This is not very productive. I'm coding Ruby because I think it's more productive than this was. But I know that I'm adopting a single-threaded, I'm building software for a distributed world, and essentially a single process, single thread per process language. We don't have green threads. We don't have threads to speak of, right? So, and parked up behind Java are all these potential languages that need to cross. And one of the questions that we have to ask is which language is going to get across? The second question that we need to ask, is it just going to be one language this time? Which I think is a valid question. We're sometimes jaded. When I say we, you in the Erlang community are not, but the rest of the world sometimes looks at the world as one true ring that in the darkness binds them, right? One true model for the whole world. And some things are changing where I don't think it necessarily needs to be that way. So here we are today, and we're looking at a set of paralyzing fears, and they're mostly related to how hard it is to learn functional programming and functional languages. I thought that Katie did a marvelous job yesterday morning when she started talking about writing her program, and that's the way that we look to the rest of the world. But I think that these fears are going to become increasingly irrelevant. They will get solved because they must get solved because the world needs what we have on this side of the chasm. What we, the early adopters, have, the world basically can't function without. So I want to talk a little bit about the paralyzing fears. And I want to specifically ask the question, what's the best way to eat an elephant? We got to eat that whole elephant to cross the chasm. One bite at a time, right? It doesn't have to all happen at once this time, because building communities is easier. If you think about it, where was Erlang built? You guys know the story. Ericsson, a little lab with Joe and Robert and the crew, and it all happened in one place, right? It all happened around one business problem. It all happened in really one company. You could really make the same argument for Sun with the Oak project that turned into the Java project and was really kind of boiled and cooked in one place. If I look at the language that I'm involved in now, and that's the Ruby community, that's Ruby on Rails. So the guy who wrote the language, where was he born? Japan. And where was David Heinemeier Hansen born? Denmark. And there are people on the core team. One of the guys that the guy that wrote Elixir, Jose Valim. He's born in Brazil and lives in Krakow now, Poland. And there are core team members that have lived in New Zealand and United States and all the continents, but I think two. And so that's a very different thing. And if we look at the Elixir language, that's evolving in a still different way. You have Jose with his company that split across Brazil and Poland. You've got Dave Thomas, who's working with him on marketing marketing the language. I've contributed. Eric, who is, are you here, Eric? Part of the Elixir core team, who is going to be speaking this afternoon at 4 o'clock, has contributed in the language. It's a worldwide thing. So we are gathering very rapidly the critical mass for this language to grow. So when you look at this big fat elephant sitting on the edge of the chasm, and you say, I have to move that whole elephant, you know, maybe you don't. Maybe you don't. So the other thing that's happening is that if you remember from the snake bitten talk last year, every time that you cross the chasm with a programming paradigm, that doesn't happen in one shot. There have to be bridging languages and bridging concepts that expose people to the ideas that you're using. And if you look at programming languages now, object-oriented languages have many functional concepts. For example, Java has even added the closure. I mean, it's a little crazy it took them this long, but Java has added the closure. And when I left Oslo, I was giving the same talk. And Venkat Subramaniam has a book called Functional Programming in Java, and he's teaching classes across Norway about how to code functionally in object-oriented languages. And they're packed. The classes are packed. Why? Because we need a bridge. People have to be exposed to the bridge to relate the old with the new. Right? That isn't relevant to the way that you code in this room, but it's relevant to bringing more of the world that will make the Erlang products and languages and virtual machine much more sustainable. Right? So the other thing that's happening is that we're starting to see deployment options that are much richer and easy to take advantage of. And this was absolutely not true the last time across. Remember the deployment problems? They took a while to solve. Now, pretty much the second that a functional language really steps across the chasm and makes it in the mainstream, they'll have deployment options that are already relatively mature. The next thing is that interfaces are cleaner, and you don't have to basically rebuild all of your corporate infrastructure at once. You can take the problem apart, and there are service-oriented architectures that many of us have already adopted that will make it easy to move your system a little piece at a time. So I work at a company called I Can Make It Better, and our first foray into the Erlang ecosystem will be with the Elixir language. And we'll be doing that one piece at a time. We'll be taking most of our back-end delayed tasks, and we'll be breaking those into Elixir. And then we'll be taking the longest running, the things that will benefit the most, the things that Ruby just can't do into Elixir. And then we'll move more. We don't have to move all of our infrastructure at once. We can do it. We can cut it up and eat that big elephant a bite at a time. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about motivating fears, and then I want to save some time for questions. So always the top fear on the list should be code complexity. Every time that we attack a new new classification of problems, and gosh, we're seeing a new classification of problems that becomes the norm for all the problems that we solve every 3 or 4 years now. Basically, we're trying to solve these problems with smaller core developers, and we're not giving the developers more time. The schedules are still shrinking. So the thing that has to take up the slack has to be the programming language. The programming language has to be able to scale up to handle more complexity. And you all know what the benefits of Erlang are with its ability to handle distributed message passing and specifically the error propagation. And nobody else on the planet gets this right like Erlang does. But there's also another element of complexity. There's the ability to roll up more concepts into a single line of code. Here's an example from my book. This is 7 more languages in 7 weeks. And I never really thought that I'd be writing this book. These books are hard. And it's kind of like that eating all those bites of spicy food that I had to eat because now, I'd brag to the waiter, right? But in this case, the excitement of all the languages that are happening now was just too much to overcome. There's Elm that's happening on the browser that we'll look at in a second. There's Idris and dependent typing that's happening. Elixir is very exciting to me. But this is basically, I'm writing some code that's a state machine. And the state machine has a vocabulary and a semantics that aren't really included in the language. But I can rapidly whip up a domain-specific language that lets me represent just the core of a state machine with the minimum possible syntax. And then the usage becomes really clean and simple. So for example, I can have callbacks built in. I can have specific calls. So each one of these states actually does, codes many more functions that I can actually put to work. Right. So the second challenge, this to me is the big challenge that's going to push us across this chasm. You heard it in the keynote this morning. You heard it in 5 talks yesterday with just about every talk in the room talking about the complexity of this kind of application. The rest of the world doesn't know how to write this kind of application. The people in this room do. Right? And when you add the capability of macros to describe these things, then I could build a chat room that looks like this. It's completely OTP backed. All of the goodness of Erlang cooked in behind it. That hides this, that hides that macro key, right? That 126 line, or how big is it now? I don't know. You know the OTP key that you have a little sticker on the keyboard that says, press me for OTP, right? Well, with macros, you can cook those concepts down into a very few lines. And it's really, most programmers today are getting better by improving their skills and getting better at the rules of the game. Some people change the rules of the game, and that's what's happening with the languages that support macros. Okay, and by the way, the DSL was written by Dave Thomas. Don't know if it's going to be part of Elixir, and the example was from Peter Minton. I think it's a pretty cool way to think about Elixir. So the next motivator, I think, is browser complexity. This is one that's kind of sneaking up on us. If you look at applications like Google Maps and kayak.com and things like that, all of these things are building on a programming model that is broken, and we know it's broken. The JavaScript type model is broken. The execution, I've been with, is Joe Armstrong here? So I've been with Joe for a couple of days now, and I think that he has said that I've heard 4 different rants on running to completion in Node.js, right? But we know this is broken. But this is a much cleaner way to express. This is a little excerpt from a game that I have where I basically code a function called display, and then where display also has to move the paddle across the bottom of a screen like a game of Pong. And then I pass it in the window dimensions and the mouse X position. And these are functions now, so this is straight functional composition. And when I embed this code, it simply works. There's no callbacks. It's just a clean and simple model. So this is what it's going to take. It's the browser complexity, the multi-core and distribution, the code complexity, cleaner interfaces, deployment options, FP features, and building communities. All of these are the things that have to happen for Erlang to cross the chasm, right? And when this happens, it doesn't have to happen all at once, right? It can happen in little pieces now, one bite at a time. So I'm going to stop now for questions or comments. I know it's controversial. I know some of you are mad, and so let's hear it now. Yeah. The browser, that was in a language called Elm. It's a brilliant language by a guy named Evan Zaplicki, I think. And he has recently joined Prezi, where he spends half his days in San Francisco and the rest in Hungary, I believe, in Budapest, yeah. And he presented this language the first time a couple of years ago at Strange Loop in St. Louis. And it's been having a lot of buzz lately. I mean, you can read about it in 7 more languages, and I'm sure in a lot of different places coming up very soon. Also mostly Erlang. Yeah, that's a great introduction to Elm. More questions or comments? Yeah. Yes, that's Paul Butcher, and he wrote 7 concurrency models in 7 weeks, a book that I edited that I didn't have to do too much to at all. But the question is, why are we going to see more than one language cross the chasm this time? What's different this time around? I think the difference is the ability to rapidly build a community that's distributed. I think that's an absolute game change. Eric is one of the members of the Elixir core team, and I dropped a note to Jose saying I got to hang out with Eric yesterday. And Jose said, yes, well, then you've met him before I did, which is kind of a cool thing. They've been collaborating on a new language that's gotten quite a bit of buzz in not just this community, but also in the Ruby community that I come from. And the 2 of the core collaborators have never met. And I think this is happening over and over. And you heard a hint of it with Katie. Are you in the room, Katie? So Katie, yes, and the Lambda ladies, you were able to build that community rapidly, even though they were across the world, where you started with 5 and now it's grown to over 200. That's absolutely different than anything we faced before. More questions or comments? Yes? So I showed an example, 2 examples in Elixir and 1 in Elm. Do I think that Erlang will be across the chasm? It's only because of my familiarity with Elixir. I think that Erlang, in some form, will absolutely cross the chasm. I think you saw the reasons for the excitement in the keynote this morning. This is really a revolutionary time, and you guys are right in the middle of it. Yes? You could be. So the comment was, how do we know that we haven't already crossed the chasm? And with 400 people in the room here, and with the activity in the Erlang, it's my impression that languages like Erlang and Scala are, as we speak, crossing the chasm. But sometimes our managers don't like to hear that, and sometimes talks like this can help us with the language to convince our management that these types of things are happening. That's why I'm giving language adoption talks in conferences like this one. Great point. Yes?
So you talked about fears. I think one fear to remember is the fear of losing users, which may make the elephant push back. I think that's behind, Java 8 is now adopted lambdas. I gather that Java 9 may even have tuples.
Oh, let's stop the crazy talk now. So the comment is, well, so yes, yes, yes. So the question, the comment was that fear not only can help you motivate across the chasm, it can also push back, and these are the stabilizing fears that I mentioned. And so, what's your name? Um, and John, we've never met face to face, but it's a pleasure to be in the same room with you. You're kind of one of my programming idols, actually. But the comment was that fear makes languages push back, and so the sales machine in our industry is absolutely loaded with fear, and there are names for it. There are. I was surfing around on Wikipedia, and I was finding the old acronyms. What does FUD mean? It means fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? So that's an acronym. That's about a sales and a debating strategy called, fear. I can't remember the name, but there's a whole branch of psychology about this type of motivation and this type of sales technique, where if we can spread enough fear, we can make that chasm far enough and wide enough that nothing else can possibly cross it. Yeah, great point. Other comments? Yeah. Okay, so this is a great question. The question is, how pure will the next paradigm be? How pure will the next language be? And this was basically what I talked about last year with the snake bites concept, and that basically the choices that we make are basically made for business reasons, and sometimes. If we're not careful, we can make the wrong choice for the wrong motivations. And as John pointed out, there are marketing forces that are happy to help us make those decisions. So if you look at right now, I see maybe 5 players that are on the edge of the chasm right now, and some of those are more pure than others. One of the ones that's the least pure is JavaScript. We're starting to see a big push for JavaScript and functional like concepts in the JavaScript language, and that's absolutely a contender. It has a lot of the same characteristics as the last 20, 30 years of languages, and the C++ syntax, and some weak spots in the typing model that we haven't seen, or that we've seen for the last 20 years. And then there's also the Scala language that has some beautiful, clean concepts in it, but there's also a lot that's been left in the language. And so part of what's coming along with the Scala community is some internal strife within that culture. So it's not just the dirty bits of the language that are difficult, but some of the toxicity in the community from the object-oriented people that don't want to let go and the functional people that want to push to be more clean. So that's absolutely a risk. And my point to you is that you can help make this decision, that you get a vote now, you have a voice. And if you talk about your concerns in a more public way, then we'll have a better chance of more of the right languages crossing the chasm. Okay, so I think we're out of time, but thank you very much for inviting me again.